Some mornings, Vivian Washington wondered if her son even remembered her phone number anymore. The silence between them had stretched so long that diving alone in the cold bay felt less lonely than sitting by a phone that never rang. At 54, she'd learned to find purpose in small things, like the strange metal capsule she pulled from the muddy bottom that Tuesday morning. It looked old but somehow untouched by time. When she opened it on the dock, her hands started shaking. Inside were her brother's dog tags from Vietnam, baby pictures of her son, and a journal written in handwriting she knew by heart. But the journal entries were dated next week. The capsule had been underwater for years, maybe decades. So how did it contain pages written in the future? How could something impossible hold the key to everything she'd lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vivian Washington had been diving the Chesapeake Bay waters since she was 17, first as a rebellious teenager skipping school, then as a Navy salvage specialist for 12 years, and now as a woman who understood that the bay held more stories than most people ever bothered to listen for. The morning light filtered through her kitchen window as she sat at the small wooden table her father had built 40 years ago. Turning the strange metal capsule over in her weathered hands, the dog tags caught the early sunlight, their dull silver surface worn smooth by decades of handling. "Jerome Washington," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet house. Her brother's name, his service number, blood type O negative, details she'd memorized from the telegram that came in 1971, the one that said he was missing in action, presumed dead. The one that had broken their mother's heart and sent their father into a silence that lasted until his own death 10 years later. But here they were, impossible as sunrise in the middle of the night. Vivian set the tags down carefully beside the photographs, images of David as a baby, as a toddler taking his first steps across this very kitchen floor, as a boy of 7 grinning gap-toothed while holding up a fish they caught together off the old pier. Pictures she'd never taken copies of, pictures that had been in her bedroom dresser the last time she'd looked. Yet here they were, somehow preserved in a capsule that had been underwater for who knew how long. The journal was what made her hands shake, though. David's handwriting as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She'd helped him with homework at this same table for years, watched him practice his signature over and over when he turned 16 and got his first checking account. The careful loops of his letters, the way he crossed his T's with a flourish he thought made him look sophisticated. It was all there on pages that shouldn't exist. September 25th, 2024. 3 days from now. Mom called today. The first entry read, "I should have answered. I keep telling myself I'll call her back tomorrow, but tomorrow keeps becoming next week, and next week becomes next month. I'm afraid she thinks I don't love her anymore. That's not true. I just don't know how to explain that leaving felt like the only way to become someone she could be proud of." Vivian's throat tightened. She reached for her phone, David's contact information glowing on the screen. Straight to voicemail, like it had been for the past 3 months. His voice, cheerful and automated. "Hey, you've reached David. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." A promise he hadn't kept since April. She'd raised him alone in this house since he was 3, after his father decided that fatherhood was more responsibility than adventure. The Navy had taught her discipline, structure, the importance of mission completion. But raising a son had taught her that love sometimes meant letting go, even when every instinct screamed to hold tighter. David had been her whole world for 15 years. Homework help and soccer practice, fishing trips and late-night talks, about everything from girls to college applications. She'd saved every penny of her disability pension and her salvage earnings to send him to the university. Proud beyond words when he got accepted to study marine biology. He was going to be the first Washington to graduate college, the first to have options beyond the bay and the small coastal town that had held their family for 3 generations. But somewhere between his freshman and sophomore year, the phone calls had become shorter, the visits home less frequent. By junior year, she was lucky to get a text message on holidays. She told herself it was natural, that boys needed to spread their wings, that she'd raised him right and had to trust that foundation now. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when she prepared her diving gear for another day of searching the bay bottom for anything worth selling, she wondered if she'd somehow failed him. The house felt too big without David's laughter echoing through the rooms. His bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it. Posters of marine life on the walls, shelves lined with books about ocean exploration, a collection of shells and sea glass they'd found together over the years. Sometimes she'd stand in his doorway and remember the sound of his voice calling, "Mom, come look at this," when he'd discovered something fascinating in one of his nature documentaries. Now the only voices in the house were the ones on the television she kept running for company, and the imaginary conversations she had with David in her head. What she would say if he called, how she would tell him about her day, the way she would listen, really listen, to whatever was troubling him enough to keep him away. The capsule sat on her kitchen table like a challenge to everything she understood about the world. Vivian had always been practical, grounded in the tangible reality of depth charts and tide tables, equipment maintenance, and underwater navigation. In the Navy, she'd learned that problems had solutions, that mysteries could be solved with enough patience and the right tools. But this defied every logical explanation she could construct. She picked up the journal again, flipping to another entry dated tomorrow. "I dreamed about the old pier again," David had written. "The one where Mom used to take me to watch the sunrise. In the dream, Uncle Jerome was there, sitting on the edge with his feet in the water. He looked older than in the photographs, but I knew it was him. He said Mom was going to need my help soon. That family was the only thing that could anchor us when everything else starts to drift." Jerome, her brother, 2 years older and 10 times braver, who'd enlisted the day after his 18th birthday because he believed in duty and honor and protecting the people you loved. Jerome, who'd written her letters from Vietnam, filled with observations about the people and the landscape, the way the morning mist reminded him of the bay back home. Jerome, who'd been declared dead 43 years ago, leaving behind a grieving family and a box of commendations that their mother had kept in her bedroom closet until the day she died. Vivian walked to the living room window that looked out over the water. The bay stretched toward the horizon, its surface painted gold and pink by the morning sun. Somewhere beneath those familiar waves, she'd found impossible things. And according to a journal that shouldn't exist, somewhere in the next few days, she was going to find her brother. The rational part of her mind, the part that had gotten her through Navy training and 20 years of single motherhood, insisted this was elaborate delusion. Grief manifesting in strange ways, perhaps, or the effects of spending too many hours alone with only her thoughts for company. But her hands that had handled thousands of artifacts pulled from the bay's muddy bottom, told her the capsule was real. The weight of it, the particular way the metal had corroded in salt water, the barnacle scars on its surface, these were things that couldn't be faked. And David's handwriting, every loop and curve as familiar as her own reflection, suggested that somehow, impossibly, her son had written about events that hadn't happened yet. Vivian returned to the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee, the same morning ritual she'd followed for 20 years. But today, the familiar routine felt different, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. She sat down with the journal again, reading David's words about family and anchoring, and the importance of not drifting away from the people who mattered most. Outside, the bay continued its eternal rhythm of tide and current, holding secrets in its depths that might just hold the key to bringing her family home. Vivian spent the rest of that Tuesday reading and rereading David's journal, each entry more impossible than the last. By evening, she'd convinced herself she was losing her mind. By Wednesday morning, she'd decided that sanity was overrated if insanity might lead her back to her family. The journal entry for September 24th, today, was brief but specific. Mom will go to Dutton's Pier at 7 a.m. She'll find Uncle Jerome sitting on the far end, feeding pieces of stale bread to the seagulls. He'll be wearing Dad's old navy jacket and will have been waiting since dawn. Dutton's Pier had been abandoned for 15 years, ever since Hurricane Isabel damaged it beyond repair. The county had never allocated funds to fix it, and now it stood like a broken finger pointing into the bay, its wooden planks weathered grey, and half its length claimed by storms and time. Vivian hadn't been there since David was 12, and they'd gone to collect shells after a winter storm. But at 6:30 that morning, she found herself driving the winding coastal road toward the pier, the journal clutched in her passenger seat like a road map to impossible destinations. The early September air carried the first hint of autumn, and the bay was calm, its surface reflecting the pale sky like hammered pewter. She parked in the gravel lot where teenagers used to bring their dates before the pier became unsafe. Weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt, and the old no trespassing sign hung at an angle, faded by salt air and sun. The wooden walkway creaked under her feet as she made her way toward the water, testing each plank carefully. Navy training had taught her to assess structural integrity, and this pier was definitely past its prime. At the far end, where the walkway terminated in a small platform overlooking deeper water, a man sat with his back to her. He wore a dark blue jacket that looked familiar, even from 50 yards away. The same Navy-issue jacket their father had worn every morning while drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. The man's hair was silver grey, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to be patient with both time and circumstance. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached. This was crazy. This was the kind of thing that happened to other people, people who believed in ghost stories and miracles, and the impossible persistence of love across decades of loss. Jerome. She called when she was 10 feet away, her voice carrying across the water. The man turned, and 43 years collapsed into nothing. It was him. Older, weathered by time and whatever experiences had kept him hidden all these years, but unmistakably her brother. The same dark eyes that had watched over her when they were children. The same crooked smile that had reassured her during thunderstorms and the first days of school. He stood slowly, as if he'd been expecting her. As if sitting on abandoned piers at dawn was the most natural thing in the world. "Hello, Vivi," he said, using the nickname only he had ever been allowed to call her. "You look just like Mama did at your age." She should have run to him, should have thrown her arms around his neck and demanded explanations. Instead, she stood frozen, caught between joy and terror, between the impossible reality of his presence and the rational mind that insisted this couldn't be happening. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, and immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. "I was supposed to be a lot of things," Jerome replied, his voice carrying the same gentle humor she remembered from childhood. Dead wasn't one of them, but it seemed safer to let people think so for a while. 43 years is more than a while, Jerome. He nodded, looking out over the water. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, sorrier than you'll ever know. But some choices you make to protect the people you love, even if they don't understand at the time." Vivian pulled the journal from her jacket pocket. "David wrote about you. In this journal. Entries dated in the future." Jerome's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or resignation. "You found the capsule. You know about the capsule?" "I put it there, Vivi. 30 years ago in a place I knew you'd eventually look. I've been watching you dive that spot every Tuesday morning for months, waiting for the tides to shift it into your path." The pier swayed gently in the morning breeze, and Vivian gripped the railing to steady herself. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this conversation, for the casual way her dead brother was explaining impossible things, while seagulls wheeled overhead and the bay lapped peacefully at the pier's supports. "Watching me," she repeated. "You've been watching me for months?" "Years, actually. I've been back in the area for almost a decade now, keeping an eye on you and David from a distance. Making sure you were safe, that you were getting by all right." I wanted to approach you sooner, but—" He paused, his hands gripping the railing. "What I'm going to tell you is going to sound crazy, Vivi. Crazier than finding your supposedly dead brother on an abandoned pier at 7 in the morning. Try me. After the last 2 days, my definition of crazy has expanded considerably." Jerome smiled at that, the expression transforming his weathered face back into something that looked more like the young man who'd left for Vietnam in 1970. "The capsule isn't just a container. Vivi, it's what we used to call a temporal anchor, a device designed to bridge gaps in time, to carry information and objects across decades when necessary." Temporal anchor. Vivian repeated the words carefully, as if saying them slowly might make them make sense. "You're talking about time travel, not travel exactly. More like communication. The ability to send specific items and information across time to specific people at specific moments. The government was working on it in the late 60s, early 70s. Experimental technology that never made it into the official record books. And you were involved in this. I was recruited for it. During my second tour in Vietnam, I showed certain aptitudes that made me valuable to the program. The ability to navigate temporal distortions, to maintain psychological stability when reality becomes fluid. It runs in families, Vivi. It's genetic." Vivian stared at him, trying to process information that seemed to slide through her mind like water through a net. "Genetic. David has it too. That's why he wrote the journal, why he was able to create temporal echoes that reached back to you. He's been experiencing episodes for months now, visions of possible futures, memories that don't quite fit his timeline. It's why he stopped calling, why he's been pulling away. He's scared, and he doesn't understand what's happening to him." The journal felt heavier in Vivian's hands, weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand. Episodes, temporal displacement events, brief moments when he slips between now and later, when he sees things that haven't happened yet, or remembers things that happened differently. It's disorienting, especially when you don't know what's causing it. Is he in danger? Jerome's hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. The program was shut down officially in 1973, but certain elements continued operating in secret. They've been monitoring families like ours for decades, watching for signs of temporal sensitivity in new generations. David's episodes have attracted their attention. What kind of attention? The kind that wants to study him, to understand how his abilities work and how they can be replicated or controlled. The kind that sees people like us as resources rather than human beings. Vivian looked down at the journal, at her son's handwriting describing dreams and visions and a longing to come home. "The capsule, you sent it to warn me, to prepare you. What's coming next is going to require all of us working together. You, me and David. Family, Vivi. It's the only thing strong enough to anchor someone when time itself starts to shift." The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the water's surface. Somewhere out there, her son was experiencing impossible things, probably feeling as lost and confused as she felt right now. But he wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. Jerome reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a compass crossed with a pocket watch. Its needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that pointed northwest, toward the inland waters where David's college was located. "Temporal disturbances," Jerome explained, noting her questioning look. "David's episodes are getting stronger, more frequent. We need to find him before they do." They, the people who never really let the program die. The ones who see temporal ability as a weapon to be controlled, rather than a gift to be protected. Vivian folded the journal carefully and tucked it back into her jacket. 43 years of grief and loss hadn't prepared her for this moment. But 30 years of diving in dangerous waters had taught her that sometimes you had to trust your equipment and your training and dive into the unknown. "How do we find him?" Jerome smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the big brother who taught her to tie knots and read tide charts and believed that family was the strongest force in any universe. "We follow the current. Vivi, we follow the current and trust that it will carry us where we need to go." Jerome's truck was older than David, a faded blue Ford that smelled like salt air and diesel fuel. As they drove northwest toward the university, Vivian studied the photograph her brother had given her, a picture of herself and Jerome as children, sitting on the dock behind their family home. But something was wrong with it, subtle differences that made her skin crawl with recognition she couldn't quite place. In her memory, she'd been wearing a yellow sundress in that photo, her hair in pigtails tied with blue ribbons. But in this version, the dress was blue and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. Jerome was smiling in her memory, but here his expression was serious, almost worried. The dock looked the same, the water looked the same, but the children in the photograph were somehow different versions of themselves. Timeline variations, Jerome explained when she mentioned it. When temporal events occur, they sometimes create ripples that alter small details in the past. Nothing major, just adjustments. Like reality trying to accommodate changes it wasn't designed to handle. You're saying this picture is from a different version of our childhood. I'm saying that childhood might be more fluid than we like to believe. Time isn't as fixed as people think, especially for families with our particular genetic markers. They drove through small towns that clung to the bay's western shore, places where generations of families had made their living from the water. Vivian watched the familiar landscape roll past and tried to reconcile this new understanding of reality with the solid, practical world she'd always known. Everything looked the same. The weathered houses, the fishing boats, the piers where old men sat with coffee and newspapers, but knowledge of temporal distortions made it all feel somehow less permanent, as if it might all shift and rearrange itself when she wasn't looking. "Tell me about David," Jerome said, as they passed a sign indicating 30 miles to the university. "What was he like growing up?" Vivian found herself smiling despite the circumstances. Curious about everything. He'd bring home injured birds, stray cats, hermit crabs he found on the beach. I'd find him sitting on the kitchen floor, talking to them like they were old friends. He believed everything could be fixed with enough patience and the right kind of attention. Sounds like he got that from you. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a Washington trait. We're too stubborn to let broken things stay broken, Jerome laughed. And the sound carried echoes of summer afternoons when they were children, when their biggest worry was whether the fish would bite and if they'd make it home before their mother called them for dinner. But the laughter faded quickly as the temporal compass in his hand began spinning more rapidly. "We're getting close to something," he said, pulling over at a rest stop that overlooked the bay. "David's episodes are intensifying. The readings are stronger than I've ever seen." Vivian looked out over the water, searching for signs of the disturbances Jerome described. The bay looked normal. Fishing boats in the distance, seagulls riding the thermals, waves that caught the afternoon light like scattered coins. But when she closed her eyes and really listened, she could almost hear something underneath the familiar sounds of water and wind. A humming, like electrical current, or like the ocean remembering songs it had forgotten how to sing. "How long have you been able to sense these things?" she asked. "Since Vietnam. There was an incident during my second tour, an explosion near an old temple that the locals said was built on sacred ground. 3 of us were caught in it, but instead of being killed, we started experiencing shifts. Moments when we'd see the jungle as it had been years before, or catch glimpses of how it might be years in the future." "What happened to the other 2? Jerome's expression darkened. "The government found them first, recruited them for the temporal program, told them they were serving their country by participating in cutting-edge research. I never saw either of them again." "Is that why you let everyone think you were dead?" "It seemed like the safest option at the time. I figured if they thought I was gone, they'd leave our family alone. I didn't realize the genetic markers would skip a generation and show up in David." The temporal compass spun faster, its needle jerking between directions like a dowsing rod over underground water. Jerome frowned at the readings, then looked up at the sky where clouds were beginning to gather in unnatural patterns, too geometric. Too organized to be entirely natural. We need to move, he said, starting the truck again. Something's happening at the university. Something big. As they drove the final 20 miles, Vivian found herself thinking about the David she'd raised. The boy who'd spent hours studying tide pools and collecting shells, who'd read every book about marine biology he could get his hands on. She'd always assumed his fascination with the ocean came from growing up near the bay, but now she wondered if it was something deeper, a genetic pull toward the temporal currents that Jerome described, an unconscious understanding that water held mysteries beyond the merely biological. The university campus sprawled across several hundred acres of rolling hills, its red brick buildings and tree-lined walkways designed to convey both tradition and progress. Students moved between classes with the confident energy of people who believed the future was something they could plan and predict. Vivian remembered David's excitement when he'd first seen this place. How he'd talked about the research opportunities and the professors who were doing groundbreaking work in marine conservation. Now the campus felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made her Navy-trained instincts prickle with warning. Too many people in dark suits moving with purpose that didn't match the academic environment. Too many vehicles parked in places that provided clear sightlines to the dormitories. Too many conversations that stopped when strangers approached. Government agents? Vivian asked, among others. There are private contractors involved now. Companies that specialize in what they call temporal asset management. They've been tracking families like ours for decades, waiting for abilities to manifest in new generations. They parked near David's dormitory, a modern building that housed marine science students. The temporal compass was spinning so rapidly now that its readings were impossible to interpret. But Jerome's expression suggested that wasn't necessarily good news. The disturbances are centered here, he said. Whatever David's been experiencing, it's reaching a critical point. Inside the dormitory, they found David's floor buzzing with nervous energy. Students clustered in small groups, whispering about their friend who'd been acting strange, who'd been talking about things that hadn't happened yet, who disappeared 3 days ago without explanation. His roommate, an earnest young man named Peter, told them that David had been having vivid dreams, writing in a journal constantly, and asking questions about temporal physics that were far beyond undergraduate coursework. He kept saying he needed to get home, Peter explained. But not home like here, home like somewhere else. Somewhere important. And he was worried about his mom, kept talking about how he needed to help her with something, but didn't know what. In David's room, they found evidence of temporal disturbances everywhere. Books that should have been in the library, personal items that belonged in Vivian's house 60 miles away, photographs that showed events from different time periods, all mixed together. The walls were covered with charts and diagrams that looked like navigation maps. But instead of plotting courses across water, they seemed to be plotting courses across time. Jerome studied the charts with growing concern. He's been trying to create a temporal map, trying to find a way to navigate between when he is and when he needs to be. But without proper training, without understanding the risks. What risks? Temporal displacement isn't just about moving through time, Vivi. It's about maintaining coherence across multiple timelines simultaneously. Get lost in the wrong current, and you might never find your way back to the timeline where you belong. Outside, storm clouds continued to gather in patterns that defied meteorology, and the temporal compass began to emit a low humming sound that seemed to resonate in Vivian's bones. Somewhere out there, her son was lost in currents she couldn't see, and she was beginning to understand that bringing him home might require navigating waters far stranger than any she'd ever explored. Jerome spread the classified documents across David's desk like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture Vivian wasn't sure she wanted to see. The papers were yellowed with age, stamped with security classifications that had probably been declassified decades ago, and filled with scientific terminology that read like science fiction written by people who took it very seriously. Project Temporal Anchor, she read from the top document. Initiated 1968. Objective: investigation of genetic markers associated with temporal perception anomalies in select family lineages. They were studying families like ours long before any of us showed signs of temporal sensitivity, Jerome explained, pointing to a chart that tracked multiple generations of test subjects, looking for patterns, trying to understand why some bloodlines could navigate temporal distortions while others couldn't. Vivian scanned the family trees mapped out in clinical detail. Names and dates and genetic markers tracked like livestock breeding records. Her own family name appeared multiple times, going back to her great-grandfather, who'd supposedly had prophetic dreams about storms and ship movements. Information that should have been private, personal, was catalogued here like data points in an experiment that had been running for over 50 years. They've been watching us our entire lives, she said, the reality of it settling like cold water in her stomach. Watching, testing, occasionally recruiting. The program was supposed to be shut down after Vietnam, but elements of it went underground. Private contractors, research institutions, government agencies that operate in the spaces between official oversight. The temporal compass on the desk spun frantically, its needle jumping between readings like a seismograph during an earthquake. Through the dormitory window, Vivian could see more dark SUVs arriving on campus, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this many times before. "They're here for David," Jerome said, following her gaze. "His episodes have been getting stronger, more visible. Yesterday he was seen having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, apparently discussing events that hadn't happened yet. This morning, his environmental science professor found him in the lab at 4 a.m., working on an experiment that wasn't assigned until next week. How do you know all this?" "I have contacts, people who've been monitoring the monitors, trying to protect families like ours from becoming test subjects again." Jerome pulled out a secure phone and dialed a number. "Marcus, it's Jerome. They're moving on the Washington boy. Yes, I know we expected this. How long do we have?" Vivian listened to the one-sided conversation while studying a document titled Temporal Displacement. Protocol, Asset Recovery and Containment. The C clinical language made her skin crawl. References to genetic resources and temporal asset management that reduced David to something between a valuable tool and a dangerous weapon. 20 minutes, Jerome said, ending the call. Maybe less. They're mobilizing a full extraction team. Extraction? Official story will be that David suffered a psychological breakdown, needs specialized treatment for his own safety. Unofficial reality is that they want to study him, train him, turn his abilities into something they can use for intelligence gathering and strategic advantage. Vivian felt the same cold fury that had carried her through Navy training when instructors tried to tell her she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, determined enough to succeed in a man's world. The idea that anyone would treat her son like a resource to be harvested and exploited awakened every protective instinct she'd developed over 20 years of single motherhood. Where is he now? That's the problem. According to my contacts, David's not just hiding, he's temporally displaced. His episodes have intensified to the point where he's spending more time in alternative timelines than in this one. He could be anywhere, any-when. The documents included maps of what they called temporal hotspots, locations where the barriers between timelines were thinner, where someone with the right genetic markers could slip between different versions of reality. Several were marked near the university, including an old research facility on the bay's north shore that had supposedly been abandoned for 20 years. The Blackwater Research Station, Jerome said, noting her attention. Officially closed in 2004 due to funding cuts. Unofficially, it's where they've been conducting temporal experiments ever since. If David is trying to find a way home, trying to navigate back to the timeline where he belongs, that's where he'd go. Then that's where we're going. Vivi, you don't understand how dangerous this is. Temporal displacement isn't like diving in rough water. You can't just rely on training and equipment to keep you safe. Get lost in the wrong timeline, and you might never find your way back. Then it's a good thing I'm not going alone. Outside, the first government vehicles were pulling into the dormitory parking lot. Through the window, Vivian could see agents in tactical gear surrounding the building, their movements coordinated and efficient. These weren't people who took no for an answer, who accepted that some things were beyond their authority to claim. Jerome gathered the documents quickly, shoving them into a waterproof bag. There's a service exit on the second floor that leads to the maintenance tunnels. We can use them to reach the parking garage without being seen. As they moved through David's room one last time, Vivian spotted something the agents would probably overlook, a small compass that looked handmade, its brass surface engraved with symbols that reminded her of navigation charts. David had always been handy with tools, had spent hours in their garage building weather stations and marine equipment. But this was different, more sophisticated, as if he'd been guided by knowledge that came from somewhere beyond textbooks and online tutorials. He made this himself, she said, showing Jerome the compass. Temporal navigation device. Crude but functional. He's been teaching himself to track temporal currents, trying to find his way back to us. Jerome studied the engravings with growing respect. Your son's abilities are stronger than I realized. Most people with temporal sensitivity need years of training to create something like this. Then why can't he find his way home? Because someone's been jamming the temporal currents around the university, making navigation impossible. They want him lost, disoriented, desperate enough to accept help when they offer it. The sound of boots on stairs echoed through the building, too heavy and too coordinated to be students. Vivian slipped David's compass into her pocket, next to the journal that had started this whole impossible journey. Somewhere out there, her son was lost in currents that flowed through time instead of water, and she was beginning to understand that rescuing him would require skills no amount of Navy training had prepared her for. But she'd learned something important in the past 48 hours. Family was its own kind of navigation system, its own kind of anchor in storms that threatened to scatter people across time and space. David had reached across impossible distances to guide her this far, and she wasn't about to let anyone, government agents, private contractors, or the laws of physics themselves, keep her from bringing him home. Jerome led her toward the service exit, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades staying ahead of people who wanted to find him. Behind them, voices echoed through the dormitory as the extraction team began their systematic search. They were thorough, professional, and completely unaware that their primary target's family had just slipped through their fingers like water through a net. Next stop, Blackwater Research Station, Jerome said as they descended into the maintenance tunnels. Hope you're ready for a different kind of diving, Vivi. The kind where depth is measured in years instead of feet. The Blackwater Research Station rose from the bay's north shore like a monument to abandoned ambition, its concrete buildings weathered grey by decades of salt air and neglect. From the water, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a defunct marine research facility that had run out of funding and political support. But Jerome's contacts had provided them with blueprints that revealed hidden levels, shielded laboratories, and power systems that drew far more electricity than any abandoned building should need. They approached by water, using Vivian's small diving boat to navigate the shallow channels that wound through the salt marshes surrounding the facility. The temporal compass Jerome carried spun wildly as they drew closer, its needle jerking between readings like a dowsing rod over a rich vein of underground water. Temporal disturbances are off the charts, Jerome murmured, studying the device's erratic behavior. Whatever they're doing in there, it's creating massive disruptions in the local timeline. Vivian cut the engine and let the boat drift toward a partially submerged dock that had once served the facility's legitimate research operations. The water here felt different against the hull, thicker somehow, as if time itself had become viscous in the vicinity of the station. When she dipped her hand over the side, the bay water was several degrees warmer than it should have been. and it seemed to pulse with an energy that had nothing to do with tides or currents. "David's college ID," Jerome said suddenly, pointing towards something floating near the dock's pilings. "But that's impossible. He lost that card 3 weeks ago, according to his roommate." Vivian fished the laminated card from the water, recognizing David's photo and the university seal. But the issue date was wrong, printed 6 months in the future, with holographic security features that didn't exist yet. David's picture looked older too, as if he'd aged years in the time since she'd last seen him. "Timeline displacement," Jerome explained, seeing her confusion. "Objects from alternative timelines sometimes wash up near temporal hotspots, especially when the barriers become unstable. This version of David's ID comes from a future where he never disappeared, where he finished college and went on to graduate school, which means he's still alive. Still has a future. In some timelines, yes. But temporal displacement creates branching possibilities, alternate versions of events. We need to find the timeline where he belongs, where we all belong, and anchor him there before the displacement becomes permanent." They secured the boat and approached the facility on foot, moving through tall marsh grass that whispered with sounds that weren't quite wind. The main building's windows were dark, but Vivian's trained eye caught the subtle signs of active security. Motion sensors disguised as weather equipment, cameras hidden in ventilation grates, patrol patterns in the disturbed vegetation around the perimeter, 15-minute intervals, as she whispered, timing the security sweeps. "Professional grade, but not military. Private contractors. My contacts say the facility employs about 30 people, mostly researchers and technicians. But there's also a security team trained in temporal containment protocols, people who know how to track and capture subjects experiencing temporal displacement." They waited for the next patrol to pass, then approached a service entrance that Jerome's blueprints indicated led to the lower levels. The door was secured with both electronic locks and what looked like some kind of temporal shielding, a faint shimmer in the air that reminded Vivian of heat. Distortion over summer pavement. Jerome produced a device that looked like a cross between a key and a tuning fork, its metal surface etched with symbols similar to those on David's homemade compass. When he touched it to the door's locking mechanism, the shimmer faded and the electronic locks disengaged with soft clicks. "Temporal key," he explained, "attunes to the specific frequency of the shielding system. Took me 2 years to build one that actually worked." Inside, the facility hummed with activity that contradicted its abandoned appearance. Fluorescent lights illuminated corridors lined with equipment that belonged in a science fiction movie. Banks of computers displaying what looked like 3-dimensional maps of time itself. Monitoring stations that tracked temporal disturbances across multiple regions. Containment cells designed to hold subjects experiencing uncontrolled displacement. "They're mapping the entire temporal landscape," Vivian said, studying the displays. "Looking for patterns, weak points, places where they can manipulate the flow of time itself." The program evolved far beyond what it was in the 70s. Now they're not just studying temporal abilities, they're trying to industrialize them. Turn time manipulation into a controllable technology that can be deployed for intelligence gathering. Strategic advantage, historical revision. They moved deeper into the facility, following signs that led toward what the blueprints labeled as displacement chambers. The air grew thicker as they descended, charged with an energy that made Vivian's skin tingle and her inner ear register pressure. Changes that had nothing to do with altitude. In a laboratory, marked temporal asset processing. They found evidence of David's presence, personal. Items from his dormitory room, DNA samples, brain scans that tracked neural activity during temporal episodes. Charts on the walls mapped his genetic markers, his psychological profile, his potential value as what the documents coldly termed a temporal operative. "They've been studying him for months," Jerome said, examining the research files. "Tracking his episodes, analyzing his abilities, waiting for the right moment to bring him in. Where is he now?" "According to this," Jerome pointed to a monitoring station that showed real-time temporal readings, He's in Displacement Chamber 3, experiencing what they call controlled temporal navigation trials. They're teaching him to move between timelines deliberately, trying to turn his natural abilities into something they can direct and control. Alarms began to sound throughout the facility, not the sharp electronic bleats of security systems, but deeper, more complex tones that suggested something fundamental had gone wrong. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red, and automated voices announced temporal containment breach in multiple languages. David, Vivian said, understanding instinctively that her son was at the center of whatever was happening. He's fighting back. Through the facility's speakers, she could hear her son's voice. Older and stronger than she remembered, but unmistakably his. This is David Washington, and I'm sending a message to anyone who's listening. They're holding people here against their will, trying to turn our abilities into weapons. If you can hear this, if you have family members who've disappeared, if you've experienced temporal episodes yourself, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. We're going to find a way home. The message cut off abruptly, replaced by security announcements and evacuation orders. Through the facility's windows, Vivian could see government vehicles arriving, more extraction teams deploying to contain whatever her son had unleashed. He's not just trying to escape, Jerome said. His voice filled with equal parts pride and terror. He's trying to free everyone they're holding. Every person with temporal abilities they've been using as test subjects. How many people are we talking about? According to the files, at least 40 individuals across multiple families. Some have been here for years, told their families they died in accidents or disappeared during routine missions. The facility shook with tremors that seemed to come from time itself. Ripples in reality that made the walls shimmer and the floors feel unstable beneath their feet. Whatever David had triggered, it was affecting the entire temporal landscape around the research station. We need to find him before the facility goes into total lockdown, Jerome said, checking his temporal compass as it spun wildly. Once they activate the emergency containment protocols, no one gets in or out, not through normal space or through temporal displacement. Vivian looked at her son's research files, at the evidence of months of imprisonment and experimentation disguised as voluntary participation. The same cold fury that had driven her through Navy training flared again, directed now at people who saw children like David as resources to be exploited rather than human beings to be protected. Then we better move fast, she said, heading toward the corridors that led to the displacement chambers. Because my son's been waiting long enough for his family to come get him. The temporal mapping device Jerome pulled from his jacket looked like a compass that had mated with a star chart, its brass surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and change when Vivian wasn't looking directly at them. As they moved deeper into the Blackwater facility, the device's needle tracked distortions in time itself, pointing them toward pockets of temporal instability, where the normal flow of causality had been disrupted. The resistance network has been planning this operation for months, Jerome explained as they navigated corridors that hummed with barely contained energy. Families who've lost children to the program, former military personnel who were recruited and escaped, researchers who quit when they realized what they were really working on. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red that reminded Vivian uncomfortably of blood. Through reinforced windows, she could see laboratories where people in protective suits worked with equipment that defied easy categorization, machines that generated fields of distorted space-time, computers that somehow calculated probability matrices for events that hadn't happened yet. Containment cells designed to hold subjects who existed partially outside normal temporal flow. How many people are involved in this resistance? About 60 families nationwide, maybe more. We call ourselves the Anchor Network, people trying to keep our children grounded in the timelines where they belong, instead of letting them be scattered across alternative histories. They paused at an intersection where the temporal mapping device's readings spiked dramatically. To their left, a corridor led toward what the facility maps labeled as long-term containment. To their right, signs pointed toward active research areas and temporal navigation training. David's signal is strongest in the research section, Jerome said, studying the device's increasingly erratic behavior. But there are at least a dozen other temporal signatures in containment. People who've been here for years, some of them barely anchored to this timeline anymore. Vivian thought about the families represented by those signatures, parents like herself who'd lost, children to a program that treated human beings as experimental resources, siblings who'd spent decades believing their loved ones were dead when they were actually imprisoned in facilities like this one. The scope of it made her Navy-trained sense of justice burn with cold fury. "We get everyone," she said. "Not just David, everyone." Jerome smiled at that, the expression transforming his weathered face into something that looked like their father when he was proud of his children for standing up to bullies. "I was hoping you'd say that. Because the plan isn't just extraction, it's complete exposure. We're going to document everything. Broadcast it through channels the government can't shut down. Make it impossible for them to continue operating in secret." The training montage that followed compressed weeks of preparation into hours of intense education. Jerome taught her to read temporal currents the way she'd learned to read water currents during her Navy diving training, looking for the subtle signs that indicated direction, strength, and potential dangers. He showed her how to use the mapping device to track temporal distortions, how to recognize the difference between natural temporal fluctuations and artificially induced displacement events. The key to surviving temporal displacement is maintaining your sense of self across multiple timelines, Jerome explained as they practiced with portable equipment in an abandoned section of the facility. "Remember who you are, where you came from, what you're fighting for. Those anchors will keep you grounded when reality starts to shift around you." Vivian learned that temporal displacement felt like the worst case of vertigo imaginable, combined with the disorientation of surfacing too quickly from a deep dive. But just as she'd mastered neutral buoyancy and decompression protocols during her military training, she found she could adapt to the strange physics of time travel through practice and determination. The deeper they moved into the facility, the more evidence they found of the program's true scope. Research files documenting experiments that had been conducted on children as young as 8 years old. Psychological profiles of families selected for their temporal sensitivity. Training protocols designed to turn natural abilities into controllable weapons for intelligence gathering and strategic manipulation. They've been using these abilities to alter historical outcomes, Jerome said, showing her classified documents that made her stomach turn. Small changes, careful adjustments that accumulate over time, preventing certain technological developments, influencing political decisions, eliminating individuals who might have changed the course of history in ways they didn't approve of. How is that even possible? Temporal displacement allows for very precise interventions. Send an operative back a few hours or days, have them plant evidence or start rumors or arrange accidents. Nothing dramatic. Enough to create paradoxes, just subtle nudges that steer events in preferred directions. The facility shook again, more violently this time, as if the building itself was being pulled between different versions of reality. Through the emergency communication system, they could hear coordination between security teams and research staff, references to cascading temporal failures and containment protocol alpha. David's not just trying to escape, Vivian realized, listening to the controlled panic in the broadcasts. He's systematically disrupting their entire operation. Jerome's pride in his nephew was evident, despite the dangerous circumstances. Your boy inherited more than just temporal sensitivity, Vivi. He got the Washington stubborn streak, too. Once he decided to fight back, he wasn't going to do it halfway. They reached a monitoring station that provided real-time feeds from throughout the facility. On multiple screens, Vivian could see the evidence of her son's rebellion, containment cells opening as their temporal locks failed, research subjects helping each other navigate the corridors toward emergency exits, security teams struggling to cope with people who could literally step sideways through time to avoid capture. David appeared on one of the monitors, older than she remembered but unmistakably her son, moving through the facility with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate temporal currents like a master sailor handling rough seas. He was carrying what looked like a more sophisticated version of the compass she'd found in his dorm room, using it to guide other escaped subjects toward temporal anchor points where they could stabilize their displacement. He's been learning their own techniques, Jerome observed with admiration, turning their training against them, using their equipment to free their other test subjects. But the monitors also showed government reinforcements arriving outside, vehicles and personnel that suggested this extraction attempt was about to become a siege. The facility's emergency protocols were designed to contain temporal disturbances, which meant that once they were fully activated, no one would be able to enter or leave through normal space or temporal displacement. "How long do we have?" Vivian asked. Jerome checked the temporal mapping device, which was now spinning so rapidly its readings were impossible to interpret. "Maybe 30 minutes before they achieve full containment. After that, anyone still inside becomes permanently displaced, scattered across multiple timelines without any way to anchor themselves back to consensus reality." The weight of that deadline settled over them like cold water. 30 minutes to find David, coordinate the escape of dozens of other temporal displacement subjects, and somehow expose the entire program before the government could implement damage control measures that would make the whole facility disappear from history. "Then we better get moving," Vivian said, checking the diving knife on her belt and the waterproof bag containing the evidence they'd gathered. "Because I didn't raise my son to spend the rest of his life scattered across time like debris from a shipwreck." Jerome led her toward the facility's central hub, where all the temporal disturbances seemed to originate. Behind them, the sounds of systematic facility evacuation echoed through the corridors, emergency personnel retreating to safe distances while automated, systems prepared to seal the building in a temporal bubble that would effectively remove it from normal space-time. "One more thing, Vivi," Jerome said as they approached the final checkpoint. "If something happens to me during this operation, if I get displaced or captured or worse, you need to know that everything we've done here has been worth it. Getting to work alongside my sister to bring her son home, that's the best ending to my story I could have asked for." Vivian squeezed his shoulder, feeling the weight of 43 years of separation and the possibility that she might lose him again before they could rebuild what time had taken away. "We're all going home together," she said. "That's the only ending I'm willing to accept." The central hub of the Blackwater facility looked like mission control for an operation that spanned centuries instead of continents. Banks of monitors displayed temporal maps that tracked disturbances across multiple timelines, while technicians in hazmat suits calibrated equipment that hummed with energies that made Vivian's bones ache. At the center of it all sat a device that looked like a metallic egg, the size of a small car, its surface covered with the same symbols she'd seen on David's compass and Jerome's temporal key, the original Capsule prototype. Jerome breathed, staring at the device with a mixture of awe and horror. "I thought it was destroyed 40 years ago," but as they approached the central chamber, Vivian saw something that made her stop cold. Among the technicians working frantically to contain the temporal disturbances was a man whose face was achingly familiar, older now, weathered by time and responsibility, but unmistakably her father, Dr. Marcus Washington, who had supposedly died of a heart attack when David was 10 years old, was very much alive and apparently in charge of the entire operation. "Hello, Vivian," her father said, looking up from a control console with the tired smile of a man who'd been carrying impossible secrets for too long. "I've been waiting for you to find your way here. Both of you," he added, nodding to Jerome. though I had hoped it would be under better circumstances. Jerome's hand moved instinctively toward the temporal key on his belt, but their father raised a hand to stop him. "That won't be necessary, son. I'm not your enemy here, even though I know it must look that way." "You're supposed to be dead," Vivian said, her voice flat with shock and betrayal. "We buried you. I watched them lower your coffin into the ground." "You buried someone, yes. A temporal duplicate created when the original displacement experiments began to affect my physiology. The real me has been here, working to develop safeguards that would protect families like ours from the government's attempts to weaponize temporal abilities." The central chamber erupted in alarms as David's rebellion reached the facility's core systems. On the monitors around them, Vivian could see her son moving through corridors that seemed to shift and change as he passed, leading other displaced subjects toward what looked like a massive temporal anchor point in the facility's lower levels. "David's not just trying to escape," their father continued, his fingers flying over control interfaces that looked more like musical instruments than computers. "He's attempting to collapse the entire temporal grid we've built here, to free everyone we've been holding, and simultaneously expose the program to worldwide scrutiny." "Good," Vivian said. "That's exactly what he should be doing." "No, Vivian, it's not." Her father's expression was grave, tinged with the weight of knowledge she was only beginning to understand. "Because the temporal grid isn't just a prison system, it's a containment field. Without it, the displaced subjects we've been stabilizing will scatter across multiple timelines simultaneously, lost forever in the spaces between when and where." Jerome stepped forward, his temporal mapping device spinning wildly. "You're saying you've been holding people here to protect them. I'm saying the situation is more complex than either of you realize. The government didn't create this program to weaponize temporal abilities. They created it to contain them. Every person with strong temporal sensitivity represents a potential tear in the fabric of space-time itself. Left uncontrolled, their natural displacement events could destabilize entire regions of the timeline." On the monitors, David appeared in the central chamber's main corridor, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate temporal currents like a fish moving through water. But behind him, Vivian could see other escaped subjects flickering between visibility and transparency, their forms becoming increasingly unstable as they moved away from the facility's containment fields. "The people we've been studying, the families we've been monitoring, they're not resources to be exploited," their father explained urgently. "They're early manifestations of an evolutionary change that could either destroy human civilization or transform it into something unimaginably better. Our job has been to learn how to guide that transformation safely by imprisoning children." Vivian's voice carried all the fury of a mother who'd spent months believing her son was lost. "By lying to families about what happened to their loved ones? By preventing a temporal catastrophe that could erase human history entirely. Vivian, your family wasn't randomly selected for this program. We've been its architects from the beginning. Your great-grandfather's prophetic abilities, your grandmother's temporal sensitivity, your own intuitive understanding of currents and navigation, all of it has been building toward this moment." The facility shook again, more violently than before, as if the building itself was being stretched across multiple timelines simultaneously. Through the emergency communication system, they could hear reports of temporal rifts opening across the entire mid-Atlantic region, disturbances that were affecting weather patterns, electronic communications, and the basic flow of causality. "David's disruption is cascading beyond our containment protocols," their father said, his hands moving frantically across the control interfaces. "If we can't re-establish the temporal grid within the next 15 minutes, the displacement effects will spread globally. Every person on Earth with even minor temporal sensitivity will begin experiencing uncontrolled displacement events." "How many people are we talking about?" Jerome asked. "Conservative estimates suggest about 2% of the global population carries the genetic markers for temporal sensitivity. That's roughly 150 million people who could be scattered across alternative timelines if the containment field collapses completely. David's voice echoed through the facility's communication system again, older and more authoritative than Vivian remembered. "This is David Washington, and I'm broadcasting on all temporal frequencies. What you're hearing is the truth about Project Temporal Anchor, about the families they've destroyed, about the lies they've told to justify treating human beings like experimental subjects. I'm sending this message across multiple timelines to every version of reality where people like us exist. You have the right to know what's being done in your name. He's not just rebelling against the program," their father said with a mixture of pride and terror. "He's conducting a coordinated exposure operation across multiple alternative histories simultaneously. Every timeline where this program exists is receiving the same broadcast, the same evidence, the same call for accountability." Vivian looked at the monitors showing her son's impossible coordinated rebellion and felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about rescuing David from government imprisonment. It was about choosing between family, loyalty, and preventing a potential apocalypse that could scatter human consciousness across infinite alternative histories. "There's something else," their father said quietly. "The reason David's abilities are so much stronger than anyone anticipated, the reason he's been able to coordinate this operation across multiple timelines, he's not operating alone. He's been in contact with alternative versions of himself. Versions from timelines where the temporal anchor program developed differently, where families like ours weren't separated and hidden and forced to fight alone." The implications of that statement settled over Vivian like cold water. Her son hadn't just learned to navigate temporal currents, he'd learned to communicate with other versions of himself, to coordinate actions across multiple realities, to turn the program's own technology against the people who'd created it. "David has become what we were trying to prevent," their father continued. "A human being so thoroughly integrated with temporal forces that he exists simultaneously across multiple timelines. He's not just displaced, he's become a living bridge between alternative histories." Is that dangerous? It's unprecedented. It could be the next step in human evolution, or it could be the beginning of the end of linear time, as we understand it. And right now, the only way to find out is to trust your son's judgment about which future he's trying to create. The central chamber's main door opened, and David walked in, looking older than his 21 years, but moving with the calm confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate storms that existed outside normal space and time. When he saw Vivian, his face lit up with the same joy she remembered from childhood mornings when he'd run to show her something wonderful he'd discovered. "Hi, Mom," he said, as if they'd spoken yesterday instead of 3 months ago. "I've got so much to tell you, and we don't have very much time before the choice becomes irreversible." Behind him, the facility's temporal containment field began to collapse, and Vivian realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her family's future, but the future of human consciousness itself. David's family locket hung around his neck, the same one Vivian had given Jerome for his 18th birthday, the one that had supposedly been lost in Vietnam 43 years ago. Now it pulsed with a soft blue light that matched the energy signatures flowing through the facility's temporal monitoring equipment. And Vivian realized, with growing understanding, that it wasn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It had become something far more significant, a key that could either stabilize the collapsing temporal grid or permanently dismantle it. "The locket has been accumulating temporal energy for decades," David explained, noting her stare. "Every time someone in our family experienced displacement, every moment of separation and longing for connection, it's all been stored in the metal lattice of that simple piece of jewelry. Jerome carried it through his displacement in Vietnam. He wore it for years after his supposed death, and now it contains enough concentrated family history to anchor or shatter an entire timeline. The facility around them continued its controlled collapse as temporal rifts spread beyond the containment protocols. Through the reinforced windows, Vivian could see reality itself beginning to fray at the edges. Trees that existed in multiple seasons simultaneously, vehicles from different decades sharing the same roadway, sections of the bay where sailing ships from the 18th century drifted alongside modern fishing boats. "How long do we have?" Jerome asked, his temporal mapping device now spinning so rapidly it appeared as a blur of brass and confusion. 17 minutes, their father replied, his hands moving across control interfaces that looked increasingly desperate. After that, the displacement cascade becomes irreversible. Every person on Earth with temporal sensitivity will begin experiencing uncontrolled jumps between alternative histories. David moved through the central chamber with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to navigate currents that existed outside normal space-time. But Vivian could see the toll his multidimensional existence was taking, moments when his form became translucent, brief flickers where he seemed to be having conversations with people who weren't there. The exhausted expression of someone maintaining consciousness across multiple realities simultaneously. "There are 3 options," David said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking from several timelines at once. "First, we restore the temporal containment grid, stabilize everyone who's been displaced, and allow the program to continue operating under reformed oversight. The displaced subjects return to their families, but the government retains the technology and infrastructure to continue temporal monitoring and intervention." "Second option?" Vivian asked, though she suspected she already knew. "We complete the grid collapse, expose the entire program to worldwide scrutiny, and accept that roughly 2% of humanity will become permanently displaced across alternative timelines. It ends the government's ability to manipulate history, but it also means millions of people lose any hope of stable existence in consensus reality." Their father looked up from his control station, his face carrying the weight of impossible choices. "The third option is the one David's been preparing for months, the reason he allowed himself to be captured and studied. It requires using the accumulated temporal energy in that locket to create what we call a family anchor, a way to stabilize displaced individuals by connecting them to people who love them across any distance, any timeline, any version of reality." "How does that work?" Jerome asked. David smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the child who'd run to Vivian with excited discoveries about tide pools and hermit crabs. "Love is the only force that remains constant across all possible timelines. No matter how much history changes, no matter which alternative reality someone gets displaced into, the connections between family members persist. We can use those connections as navigation beacons, as anchor points that allow displaced people to find their way home." "What's the catch?" Vivian asked, because her Navy training had taught her that elegant solutions usually came with hidden costs. "The family anchor process requires someone to serve as a permanent bridge between timelines," their father explained quietly. "Someone who gives up their existence in any single reality in order to maintain the connections that keep everyone else stable. It's a form of temporal sacrifice, one person scattering themselves across infinite possibilities so that others can remain anchored to the timeline where they belong." The weight of that explanation settled over the central chamber like deep water. Through the facility's communication system, they could hear the chaos spreading beyond the research station, reports of temporal anomalies in major cities, government agencies struggling to cope with reality distortions that defied every existing protocol, families separated across alternative histories, calling for loved ones who existed just outside their reach. "You're planning to make that sacrifice," Vivian said, understanding flooding through her like the cold shock of diving into winter water. "You're going to scatter yourself across multiple timelines to keep everyone else anchored. It's the only way. The locket contains enough accumulated family connection to power the anchor process. but it requires someone with strong enough temporal abilities to channel that energy across infinite realities simultaneously. Someone who's already learned to exist in multiple timelines at once. Jerome stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. No, if anyone makes that sacrifice, it should be me. I've already been displaced for 43 years, already spent decades existing between timelines. I'm the logical choice. We're not making this decision based on logic, their father said firmly. We're making it based on what's best for the maximum number of people, including our own family. David's abilities are uniquely suited for the anchor process. Anyone else attempting it would simply be destroyed by the temporal forces involved. The facility shook again, more violently than before, as temporal rifts began opening in the central chamber itself. Through one of them, Vivian caught a glimpse of an alternative version of the room, where she was 20 years younger, where David was still a child, where Jerome had never gone to Vietnam and their father had never faked his death. Through another, she saw a timeline where the temporal anchor program had never existed, where their family had remained together and happy and ignorant of the cosmic forces that shaped human destiny. There's a fourth option, Vivian said suddenly, the solution crystallizing in her mind with the clarity that had carried her through 20 years of challenging diving operations. What if we don't need one person to serve as a permanent anchor? What if we distribute the burden across multiple family members, sharing the temporal displacement so that no one has to be completely sacrificed? David's eyes widened with possibility and hope. A network anchor instead of a single point anchor. It could work, but it would require precise coordination between multiple people with temporal abilities. And it would mean that all of us would exist partially outside normal time for the rest of our lives. Would we still be able to maintain relationships with each other? Jerome asked. Would we still be able to live together as a family? More than that, their father said, his voice filled with growing excitement as he ran calculations on the temporal grid computers. A network anchor would actually strengthen family connections across all possible timelines. You'd be able to sense each other's thoughts and emotions regardless of physical distance, to coordinate actions across multiple realities, to ensure that no family member ever gets truly lost, no matter how far they might drift from consensus reality. The 15-minute deadline approached with the inevitability of an incoming tide. Around them, reality continued to destabilize as temporal rifts spread beyond the facility's containment systems. But for the first time since this impossible journey began, Vivian felt the kind of calm confidence that had carried her through her most challenging Navy operations. "Then that's what we do," she said, reaching for her son's hand and finding it solid and warm despite his multi-dimensional existence. "We anchor each other. We use the love and connection that's kept our family together across 43 years of separation and loss, and we turn it into something strong enough to stabilize the entire temporal landscape." Jerome took her other hand, his grip carrying the weight of decades spent protecting his family from shadows they couldn't see. Their father moved away from the control stations, joining the circle that was forming around David and the glowing locket that contained their accumulated family history. "The process will be irreversible," their father warned. "Once we initiate the network anchor, we'll be permanently changed, permanently connected across all possible timelines. We'll never be able to live normal lives again. We stopped living normal lives the moment you started this program 40 years ago," Vivian replied. "But maybe normal was never what our family was meant for anyway. Maybe we were always supposed to be the people who help others find their way home through storms that exist outside ordinary time and space." David lifted the locket from around his neck, its blue light intensifying as he held it in the center of their family circle. "Ready?" Vivian looked around at her brother, her son, and her father, 3 generations of Washingtons who'd been scattered across time and space and impossible circumstances, but who'd never stopped loving each other, never stopped trying to find their way back to connection and understanding. "Ready?" she said. and felt the temporal energies that had shaped their entire family history begin to flow through them, like currents that could carry them anywhere they needed to go. As long as they traveled together, the countdown to temporal catastrophe reached its final minute, and the Washington family prepared to either save human consciousness or transform it into something unprecedented. In the history of the universe, the temporal core interface, at the heart of the facility, looked like something between a giant compass and a three-dimensional star chart, its metallic surfaces covered with symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as Vivian watched. David approached it with the confidence of someone who'd spent months learning to read temporal currents. The family locket in his hand pulsing with accumulated decades of love and separation and desperate longing for connection. The interface requires genetic input from 3 generations, their father explained, his voice tight with the awareness that they had less than 3 minutes before the displacement cascade became irreversible. 3 people, each representing a different relationship to the temporal forces we're trying to stabilize. Past, present, and future. Memory, experience, and possibility. Jerome stepped forward first, his weathered hands finding the interface sections marked with symbols that represented temporal displacement and return. I'll anchor the past, the memories and experiences that connect us to who we were before any of this started. The fishing trips and family dinners and quiet mornings that taught us what love actually means. Vivian moved to the center section, her hands finding controls that hummed with energy that reminded her of deep ocean currents. I'll anchor the present, the choices we're making right now, the determination to keep our family together no matter what forces try to scatter us across time and space. David approached the 3rd section, but as he reached for the interface controls, his form began to flicker more rapidly between visibility and transparency. The multidimensional existence he'd maintained for months was taking an increasing toll, and Vivian could see the exhaustion in his movements, the way he seemed to be aging backwards and forwards simultaneously as temporal forces pulled at his consciousness. David, "Oh," she said, reaching toward him, but her hand passed through his arm as if he were becoming a ghost. "I'm losing coherence," David said, his voice carrying harmonics from multiple timelines. "The longer I exist across multiple realities, the harder it becomes to maintain stable form in any single one. If I try to interface with the temporal core now, I might destabilize the entire process. Then we need a different approach," Jerome said, studying the interface with growing understanding. "The core requires 3 genetic inputs, but it doesn't specify that they have to come from 3 separate people. What if one person channels the genetic essence of multiple family members?" Their father looked up from the monitoring stations, his expression shifting between hope and terror. "That's theoretically possible, but it would require someone to temporarily absorb the temporal signatures of other family members. The psychological stress alone could be fatal, not if the person doing the channeling has enough practice navigating multiple identities simultaneously," Vivian said, understanding flooding through her. "Someone who's already learned to exist as different versions of themselves across alternative timelines." David's flickering form solidified slightly as he focused his multi-dimensional awareness. "I can channel all 3 genetic inputs, but I'll need physical contact with each family member to access their temporal signatures. And the process will require me to temporarily become each of you, to experience your memories and emotions and perspectives as if they were my own." The facility continued its structural collapse around them, temporal rifts opening in the walls and floors like windows into alternative histories. Through one of them, Vivian caught a glimpse of a world where their family had never been separated, where Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations had continued uninterrupted for decades. Through another, she saw a timeline where the temporal anchor program had succeeded in weaponizing human consciousness, where people like David served as involuntary bridges between realities controlled by government agencies. 1 minute until cascade failure, their father announced. his hands moving frantically across emergency protocols that were designed to contain temporal disasters, but had never been tested on this scale. Vivian placed her hand on David's shoulder, feeling the strange dual sensation of touching someone who existed partially in multiple realities. "What do you need from us?" "Trust," David said simply. "Trust that I can carry your experiences without losing myself in them. And trust that the love that's held our family together across 43 years of separation is strong enough to anchor an entire timeline." Jerome joined the contact, his weathered hand covering both of theirs. "You got it, nephew. All of it." Their father completed the circle, his scientific certainty finally giving way to faith in forces that couldn't be measured or controlled. "Remember," he said as the temporal core began to respond to their combined genetic signatures, "love is the only constant across all possible timelines. No matter what you see, no matter what memories you experience, no matter how lost you might feel in the currents of alternative history, that connection is your anchor home." David closed his eyes and began the process of channeling 3 generations of Washington family experience, his consciousness expanding to encompass memories that weren't his own, emotions that belonged to people he loved, and temporal signatures that would either stabilize the collapsing timeline or scatter them all across infinite alternative histories. The temporal core interface blazed with light that seemed to come from inside time itself, and Vivian felt her son's awareness touch her mind with the gentle curiosity of someone learning to navigate entirely new kinds of connection. "I can see everything," David whispered, his voice carrying echoes of 3 generations of family history. "Every choice we made, every moment we missed each other, every time love carried us through impossible circumstances. It's all here, Mom, all of it." The countdown reached 0, and the fate of human consciousness hung in the balance between catastrophic displacement and unprecedented connection. The fathers. Research journal materialized in David's hand as if summoned from the depths of time itself. Its pages filled with calculations and observations that spanned 40 years of study into the fundamental forces that connected human consciousness across multiple realities. As David channeled the genetic essences of 3 generations, the journal's contents flowed through his awareness like a river of accumulated wisdom about the nature of love and time. "The key insight," David said, his voice now carrying harmonics from his grandfather's scientific precision, his mother's practical determination, and his uncle's hard-won experience with temporal displacement, is that family bonds create stable pathways through the chaos of alternative timelines. Love doesn't just transcend time, it actually structures it, creates the framework that allows consciousness to navigate between different versions of reality. Vivian felt her son's awareness touch the deepest memories of her relationship with David, the first time he'd said, "Mama," the nights she'd sat by his bedside when he was sick, the morning he'd left for college, and she'd stood in the doorway watching him drive away toward a future she couldn't control or predict. All of it flowed through the temporal core interface, transformed from personal history into stabilizing energy that could anchor displaced consciousness across infinite possibilities. Jerome's memories joined the flow. Childhood afternoons teaching, Vivian to tie knots and read weather patterns, the terror and confusion of temporal displacement in Vietnam, decades of watching over his family from the shadows while maintaining the fiction of his own death. His sacrifice became part of the stabilizing matrix, proof that love could endure separation, loss, and the distortion of time itself. Their father's scientific understanding provided the framework that transformed emotional connection into practical, temporal technology. His research revealed that consciousness naturally sought stable anchor points across multiple timelines, and that family relationships provided the strongest possible anchoring because they existed independently of specific historical circumstances. "It's working," their father announced, monitoring the facility's systems as temporal rifts began to stabilize. The displacement cascade is reversing. Subjects throughout the facility are regaining coherence, reconnecting with their primary timelines. But the process was taking an enormous toll on David, who was now channeling not just 3 generations of family experience, but also the temporal signatures of dozens of displaced subjects throughout the facility. His form flickered more rapidly between multiple states of existence, and Vivian could see him aging and becoming younger simultaneously as he attempted to stabilize people across decades of temporal displacement. "David's burning out," Jerome said, his hands still maintaining contact with the temporal core interface. "He's trying to anchor too many people at once." The human consciousness wasn't designed to handle this much multidimensional stress. Through the facility's monitoring systems, they could see the results of David's sacrifice. Research subjects who'd been trapped between timelines for years were solidifying into coherent existence. Families separated by temporal displacement were being reunited across impossible distances, and the global cascade of reality distortions was beginning to stabilize. But David himself was becoming increasingly translucent. His consciousness scattered across so many alternative timelines that maintaining existence in any single reality was becoming impossible. "Son," their father said urgently, "you need to release some of the temporal load. Let the other subjects anchor themselves through their own family connections. You can't save everyone by carrying them all personally." "Yes, I can," David replied, his voice now carrying echoes from dozens of displaced individuals he was shepherding back to their proper timelines. "This is what we were meant for, Dad. Not to be weapons or resources or experimental subjects, but to be bridges, to help people find their way home when they get lost in the spaces between reality and possibility." Vivian felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son's sacrifice. His own temporal stability to save strangers he'd never met, families he'd never known, children who'd been trapped in temporal displacement through no fault of their own. It was the same generous spirit that had driven him to rescue injured birds and stray cats. Scaled up to cosmic proportions, the family anchor is stabilizing, their father reported, his voice filled with equal parts amazement and grief. David successfully created a permanent network that connects displaced individuals to their families across any timeline, any distance, any version of reality. But the process is consuming his own temporal coherence. Jerome tightened his grip on the interface, pouring his own life force into the stabilization process. "Take what you need from me, David. I've already lived longer than I expected. Longer than I deserved after disappearing from your lives for 43 years. And from me," Vivian added, feeling her own consciousness stretch across multiple timelines as she shared the burden of anchoring displaced souls. "We do this together as a family, or we don't do it at all." The temporal core blazed with light that seemed to emanate from love itself, transforming the accumulated pain and separation of 4 decades into a force powerful enough to restructure the fundamental relationships between consciousness and time. Through the facility's windows, they could see reality stabilizing, trees that existed in single seasons again, vehicles from appropriate decades, the bay returning to its normal pattern of tides and currents. But the cost was becoming clear. To maintain the family anchor network that would protect temporal displacement subjects around the world, the Washington family would need to exist permanently between timelines, serving as living bridges that allowed others to navigate safely through the chaos of alternative realities. "We'll still be together," David said, his form beginning to solidify again as Jerome and Vivian shared the temporal load. "More connected than we've ever been, able to sense each other's thoughts and emotions across any distance. The family anchor doesn't separate us. It makes our connection stronger than anything that exists in normal space-time." Their father stepped back from the monitoring stations, his scientific instruments no longer necessary now that the stabilization process had become self-sustaining. "The displacement cascade has been reversed," he announced. "Every person with temporal sensitivity who was scattered by the facility's collapse has been safely anchored to their primary timeline. Families around the world are being reunited with loved ones they thought they'd lost forever. The facility around them began to dissolve, not through destruction, but through transformation into something that existed between realities rather than in any single one. They were becoming the anchor point themselves, the stable center that would allow others to navigate temporal currents without being lost in them. Are you ready?" David asked, his hand still holding the family locket that had absorbed 43 years of love and longing and determination to stay connected despite impossible circumstances. Vivian looked around at her brother, her son, and her father, 3 generations of Washingtons who'd been scattered by forces beyond their control, but who'd never stopped loving each other, never stopped trying to find their way back to connection and understanding. "Ready," she said, and felt the temporal energies transform them into something unprecedented, a family that existed simultaneously across all possible timelines, anchored by love that was stronger than time itself, dedicated to helping others find their way home through storms that existed outside ordinary reality. The Washington family became the first successful network anchor, proving that human consciousness could evolve beyond the limitations of linear time, while maintaining the connections that made existence meaningful and worthwhile. 6 months after the collapse of the Blackwater Research Station, Vivian Washington stood on the dock behind her family home, watching David work on his boat, while the morning sun painted the Chesapeake Bay in shades of gold and possibility. The simple brass compass in her hand, a new one, built by David to help her navigate the subtle temporal currents that now flowed through everyday life, pointed steadily toward true north. Both magnetic and emotional, the transformation hadn't been what any of them expected. Instead of existing as scattered consciousness across infinite timelines, the Washington family had discovered that their network anchor status allowed them to live remarkably normal lives while maintaining unprecedented connection to each other and to the dozens of other families they'd helped stabilize during the facility's collapse. David looked older now, his face carrying the wisdom of someone who'd navigated storms that existed outside normal time and space. But he was also more present than he'd been since childhood. The constant temporal displacement episodes had ended, replaced by a calm awareness of the currents that connected all possible versions of reality. He'd returned to college, completed his marine biology degree, and was now working on graduate research into what he called consciousness ecology, the study of how human awareness interacted with environmental systems across multiple dimensions. Morning. "Mom!" David called from the boat, his voice carrying the easy warmth of someone who no longer feared losing the people he loved. "Ready for that dive we planned?" Vivian smiled, remembering the child who'd brought her injured seabirds and hermit crabs, who'd believed everything could be fixed with enough patience and the right kind of attention. That generous spirit had saved not just their family, but hundreds of others who'd been scattered across alternative timelines by government experiments they'd never consented to participate in. The phone calls between them had resumed within days of their transformation, but they were different now, deeper, more honest, carrying undertones of connection that transcended ordinary communication. David had explained that he'd pulled away during college, not because he'd stopped loving her, but because the temporal displacement episodes had made him feel like he was losing his mind, unable to explain what was happening to him, afraid of worrying her with problems he couldn't articulate. He'd chosen silence over what he'd feared would be burden and confusion. "I kept thinking you'd be disappointed in me," David had said during one of their long conversations about the months of separation. "That you'd raised me to be stronger than someone who hears voices and sees things that aren't there. I didn't realize until later that the voices and visions were actually other versions of myself, trying to coordinate across multiple timelines to protect the people I loved. Now they talked every day, sometimes by phone and sometimes through the direct connection that their network anchor status provided. Vivian could sense his thoughts and emotions, regardless of physical distance, could feel his excitement when his research uncovered new insights about the relationship between consciousness and reality, could share his quiet contentment during the evenings when he sat on his own dock 60 miles away, watching the same bay she watched, and knowing they were connected by forces stronger than space and time. Jerome had decided to make his resurrection official, returning from the dead with a story about surviving capture in Vietnam and spending decades in remote regions before finally making his way home. The explanation satisfied government agencies that had more pressing concerns than investigating 40-year-old presumed casualties, and it allowed him to reclaim his identity without revealing the true nature of their family's transformation. He'd moved into the small apartment above Vivian's garage, spending his days helping David with research and his evenings teaching neighborhood children the navigation and survival skills he'd learned during his decades of temporal displacement. The silver in his hair caught the morning light as he emerged from the garage workshop where he'd been building temporal mapping devices for other families affected by the government's discontinued experiments. Their father had chosen a different path, working openly with congressional committees and international oversight organizations to document the full scope of Project Temporal Anchor and ensure that nothing like it could operate in secret again. His testimony had led to the establishment of protective protocols for individuals with temporal sensitivity, family support networks for those affected by displacement, and research programs dedicated to understanding temporal abilities as natural human variations rather than resources to be exploited. The government's official position, he'd explained during one of their family dinners, is that temporal sensitivity represents an evolutionary adaptation that could benefit humanity if approached with proper ethical oversight and family-centered support systems. No more secret facilities, no more unauthorized experiments, no more treating children like potential weapons. The broader world had adapted to the revelation of temporal abilities with the resilience that humans had always shown when confronted with expanded understanding of reality. News reports about families reunited across impossible circumstances had initially generated skepticism and controversy, but the evidence was too widespread and too well documented to dismiss. Scientists, philosophers, and ordinary people had begun grappling with the implications of consciousness that could navigate between alternative timelines, relationships that transcended the normal limitations of space and time. For Vivian, the most profound change wasn't the cosmic scope of their transformation, but the return of simple pleasures she'd thought were lost forever. Sunday morning phone calls with David discussing everything from his research to his growing relationship with a fellow graduate student who shared his passion for marine conservation. Fishing trips with Jerome, where they could finally talk about the 43 years they'd lost and the unexpected gift of being able to rebuild their relationship with the wisdom that came from surviving impossible circumstances. Family dinners where their father told stories about their childhood that helped them understand how their temporal abilities had manifested long before any of them recognized them for what they were. Quiet evenings when she could feel the contentment of her loved ones like warm currents flowing through water, knowing that regardless of where their individual journeys might take them, they would never again be truly separated. The new compass in her hand spun gently as a school of fish passed beneath the dock, their movement creating subtle temporal currents that registered on the device's sensitive mechanisms. David had explained that all living things generated minor distortions in space-time, that consciousness itself was a force that shaped reality in ways that science was only beginning to understand. "Ready to explore?" David asked, pulling on his diving gear. Vivian looked out over the bay that had been her home for 54 years, its familiar waters now revealing depths and currents she'd never suspected existed. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the remains of the capsule that had started this impossible journey, probably already being transformed by salt water and time into something that future divers might find and wonder about. "Ready?" she said, and dove into waters that connected not just to the Atlantic Ocean, but to infinite possibilities, knowing that wherever the currents might carry her, she would never again dive alone. The Washington family had learned that some mysteries were meant to bring people home to each other, and that love was indeed the only force strong enough to anchor consciousness when reality itself began to shift and change.